Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. Sometimes I'm driving down the road and I listen to podcasts. Frankly, I do that a lot if I'm the only one in the car. One of my favorites is Jeremy Lee's. He was talking about the consistency of grading. And he was looking at it from the point different graders are not consistent among each other as well as within their own building. There's lots of reasons why grading is not perfectly consistent. So I've labeled this grading consistency when really I'm thinking I want to be grading consistency, not the consistency of grading. It's not perfectly consistent, but how do we evaluate what is good enough consistency? First, thanks sponsors, Topps, Panini, Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Huggins Scott Auctions, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, ComC.com, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. First, I'm going to give you what I pulled over to the side of the road and recorded, and then I will come back and add a few comments that I thought, I'm driving down the road, just doing it as a quick response. Then I had some additional thoughts. Here's the first part, and stick around for the second part too. Consistency in grading. I just listened to Jeremy Lee saying you could send the same card 6 times and you don't get the same thing all 6 times. I don't have a problem with that. My problem is when they're wildly off. If you send it in 6 times and 3 times it came back a 5.5 and 3 times it came back a 6, fail to see the problem in that. I know there's a differential there, or 5 6s and a 7 that could happen. And I don't have a huge problem with that. Okay. There's some variability. Accuracy is more important than consistency. The other one he mentioned was that they sent it in and it was a 2, and then they sent it back in and it was a 7. Okay, that's not a consistency problem. It is in one sense, but a whole deal when you're about the grader's ability is certainly partly to come up with a number, or in BGS case, to come up with the subgrades, to be able to evaluate the card by the words or by the numbers, by the standards that are imposed. But my test for graders, before you even get to that, is the ability to see the flaw. And if you don't see the flaw, some horrible stain on the back, whatever, some discoloration or some notching that you somehow missed that would make it a 2, then yes, it would be a 7 without that being recognized. Now, if you've got grader notes or you've got subgrades, you can see, okay, that's what's going on there. If you're on the receiving end of a card that's overgraded, you're probably going to leave it alone. If it's undergraded, you're going to resubmit it. So I don't see the huge problem there. It's evidence of an imperfect system. But if 5 graders give it a 7 and 1 gives it a 7.5, I understand there's a value difference there. But to me, that's really good consistency. And that's probably true if you sent the same card 6 times to PSA, SGC, BGS, CGC, anybody. Okay. The only one where it might not be possibly is tag, where there's supposedly no human intervention. It's just purely the machine looking at the card and it's going to see it the same way. But even then, there could have been a ding when you cracked it and resubmitted it. And so sometimes that's going on. I've cracked a lot of cards out, and occasionally one gets damaged. They dropped on the corner. Now with BGS, when you crack it out, you've still got the inner sleeve for protection. But some of the other slabs I've broken out, it's a potential problem. So the fact that you sent it in 6 times and you didn't get the same 6 times in a row, is that really a reasonable standard for something that admittedly has subjective elements? In fact, that's the problem with tag, is that I don't think they do have subjective elements. And I think subjective elements can be good. Let's say surface. Is that subjective? I think the criticism of tag is that if you magnify enough, you might be able to see surface scratches that are undetectable to the human eye. Take points off. And then edges, I guess the same thing. If you magnify the edges and look very closely, you can see, especially with some of these peaches, there's a rough cut. Okay. But if they're all like, but that's the dilemma we had at BGS. And it's otherwise perfect. Corners, same thing. The more you magnify, not always, but in any vintage card, it seemed like the more you magnify it, you see just that tiniest bit of fraying. And if it's not on the front, it might be on the back. And that's another thing where people don't think the consistency, they crack about consistency, but most people don't look at the back. They look mainly at the front and then cursory look at the back. Graders probably spend more time on the front, but on the back is where those cards get dinged. And even though they give it less weight, that's part of the eye appeal. If something is downgraded by back damage or back situation, that's not as big a deal. Creasing, there are creases that you can barely detect from your eye, but you can see it. And through the slab and through the inner sleeve, sometimes you really can't see it. So centering, it's a full bleed card. Unless you know the standard, the art on the card might be off-centered in a way that's for effect. If it's a bordered card, yeah, you can easily do the centering, but a lot of cards are not bordered. If it's consistent that they do it wrong each time, that's not good. I want to be accurate, and I'm willing to tolerate if something was a half grade off, in my opinion, it's my opinion, and I'm biased if it's my card. Most people are biased if it's their own card. You can send it back in. If you think it's undergraded, if you think it's overgraded, yes, you could disclose that when you're trying to sell it. Hey, I think this is overgraded, but just want to let you know that's your opinion and you think it's overgraded. The only way you can think it's overgraded is if you see a flaw that is more serious than what the graders took into account. And like I said, if it's a flaw in the back, that doesn't count off as much. Yeah, centering, corners, edges, surface, all of them. If one company had different equipment than another, I think most of the grading companies have similar equipment now. But if they didn't, or if it's calibrated differently, or it's a newer model, there's lots of reasons why you could get a slightly different grade. And I don't have a problem with that. I think people vote with their dollars. They've voted with their dollars that PSA is the standard. And if you're more lenient than PSA, that's noticed. If you're stricter than PSA, that's noticed. And that's a brand identity or a brand promise. If you're capricious, if your grades are bouncing, if you don't have internal consistency within the company because of a whole bunch of different graders, it's not that they woke up and got a bad night's sleep or something as much as you just got lots of different graders and grading tests to see if you can grade cards. You don't get hired because you got a perfect score. You got hired because you had a score good enough to be trained. Because if you don't come in as an expert grader, yeah, that would be very rare. Maybe Derek Grady could do that. But you come in and they're going to teach you, again, how much off is this one soft corner on the back. Okay, that was my stream of consciousness. What I was realizing is that in spite of everything I said, the most inconsistent thing is eye appeal. The most subjective thing is eye appeal. Two people rarely agree. I think two graders can agree to a much greater extent than two people trying to evaluate eye appeal. Now, they're trying to make it easy because they want to do eye appeal given they can look at the grade. But if you were just going to do eye appeal without any numerical reference, if it's not in the slab and you're looking at it, I think two people, even how they do it, the subjectivity is much greater. Because eye appeal ignores or builds on the technical grade. The technical grade can be not liked. It can be hated, even though it may be accurate to the standards. Ideally, the technical grade incorporates some of the aspects of eye appeal, certainly on the front of the card, but the technical grade can be technically true and the eye appeal can be subjectively, can be true as well, but it's extremely subjective. When we started doing BGS, PSA was the standard and we thought, okay, we want to do our own thing, but if we're way off from what PSA has, that's not going to work. We could be stricter in some things, or we were stricter in terms of centering, and we tried to convey that with the report card and the subgrades. But even PSA was capturing their determinations, I think partly based on some of the things that were in my annual price guides, where we had a condition guide that would expressed in words what VGX, near mint, all those things meant. And certainly when we got the grading service started, we tried to give industry standard grades, not how could you come up with that? We wanted to explain it. So it's all about looking at the card and deducting for flaws and imperfections. And tag, I'm sure, being a machine-driven automated system without human intervention, the humans are still have programmed it for how many points off something is. They've got 1,000 points to work with. Another thing is cracking slab. I don't think I've cracked more than anybody, but I've cracked more than anybody that was on that program. I think the BGS and some of these slabs have a male-female fit, so you can't just pry it out without cracking it first. So it's not a sandwich with two pieces of plastic bread where you can wedge it. You've got to crack it. And I don't recommend a hammer either. I use bolt cutters. I cut off the corner of the top of the slab, trying to leave the label intact. Use safety glasses, or at least glasses, because there could be flying shards. I take a wide flathead screwdriver, the little chisel thing. I wedge it in and then gently turn it until the sonic seal pops. And thankfully, there's an inner sleeve with BGS, so sometimes the card goes flying. I don't want it to, and the slab rarely breaks into two equal parts, so it's a big mess. I had great difficulty with some of the off-brand slabbing grading companies that had more rubbery kinds of slab instead of plastic. That was more difficult. And some people know, but I used to have a card barn. I have a card wall and I have a card cave, but I had a card barn a number of years ago, and I could do all that stuff in there. If stuff went flying, no big deal. It was a barn. And usually I crack before I submit, and I like to try to keep the flip. I try to make the point that consistency is less important than accuracy. The example would be, in the old days, National League umpires and American League umpires, they positioned themselves differently. So they saw it slightly differently. And of course, you could imagine a tall umpire or a short umpire would you call them to the best of their ability, but they might have a slightly different strike zone. But the batters learn that umpire that day, like the leadoff hitter, he's trying to figure out, they're giving you the outside corner or how's it going? All you want from your umpire is that they're consistent. But ideally that they're accurate. If it is a strike, they're calling it a strike. But if they're always calling it a certain way, you learn to live with that. That's exactly what's going on here. If an umpire was terribly inconsistent, hence terribly inaccurate, they hopefully be fired. And I think they're moving toward machine validation, verification of strikes and balls. That'll be interesting. We'll see about that. So accuracy, it's not like a bow and arrow where you can go look at the target and say, yep, that's in the bullseye. Because what people mean by accuracy in grading is, do I agree with the grade? It's not, hey, everybody says this is a 9, but it's graded as an 8. No, not everybody doesn't say it's. The grader said it was an 8, and you think it's a 9, and your friends think it's a 9. That's popular opinion accuracy. That's kind of democratic accuracy, not accuracy to a standard, and not expert accuracy. The true accuracy is adherence to the technical standard. And PSA, like it or not, has become the standard. But they weight things slightly different than some of the other grading companies. And I know BGS, we were not a copycat grader. We told it like it was, where we saw it. PSA adopted a different strategy back in the day. They had OC and MK for qualifiers. A lot of people don't like that, but collectors and dealers have learned how to incorporate that into their valuations. Okay, so what happens if you find one of the cards I've talked about that has the initials JB on the back of the card in ink? What are you going to do? Now, first of all, don't say sentimentally you're going to pick it up because you're going to show me, but it could be a different JB. But buy the card. If it's an otherwise good card and it's got the initials in ink on the back, it's going to get clobbered in the technical grade. And the front of the card might be just stellar. It could be pristine on the front. But if it's got writing on the back, again, PSA might put an MK, but the other grading companies might knock it way down. Then it would be, in that sense, a bargain if all you care about is the eye appeal on the front of the card, which is the subject of my episode I did a few years ago of FCG grading, front and center grading. Just looking at the front of the card, hold it out 18 inches, not a big deal if it's got problems on the back. My card wall is only displaying card fronts. When I was doing the company and trying to be a leader, when we were doing the price guides, we didn't want to make mistakes. But instead of thinking we're going to keep going over this and over it and double check and triple check so that we won't have any mistakes, that's not feasible. We weren't seeking perfection. We would like to have perfection, but we really wanted high standards. And if we've been through it twice, double checked it, then we got to go to press. And if there is a mistake in there, we'll fix it the next month, as we did and as we should. And we didn't make very many mistakes. But again, there's a fluidity to pricing. The reason cards get resubmitted partly is because the submitter is still displeased. They submit it one time, it's an 8. Then they go to a different company or the same company, it's still an 8. And instead of thinking, maybe I'm wrong, and they're voting with their dollars, and say, I'm going to submit it again. I'm going to try a different grader, different time. If you can't even see the defect, which amateurs sometimes can't, and inexperienced graders can't. The experienced graders can see the defects. So in the training, you've got to be able to see it. And then we can train them to say, okay, now that is, for example, like a major defect that really is bothersome, or a minor defect, a minor flaw, maybe a point off, or a micro flaw, which is only seen under 10x or more magnification. Okay, last two things. Jeremy, I think, consults for TAG, and I've met those guys, and I like them, and I'm interested in what they're doing. This is a technicality. I think they are immediately consistent. In other words, if you run the same card back through without slabbing it 6 times in a row, I think you'll get almost exactly within a couple of points out of 1,000 from tag. I'm calling that immediately consistent. Tag even will be eventually inconsistent. For example, sending a card that was graded 10 years ago to PSA, if you just sent it 10 years ago a second time, you might have gotten the second time. 10 years later, there has been some evolution of standards. Same thing with BGS. And tag will be the same way. In 5 years, when you regraded a tag card, 5 years later, it's possible their algorithm has evolved, has learned that the valuations in the marketplace, in other words, I think their algorithm will be learning. And so you could get something different. Okay. So it's not fair to compare just a tag right now because they're a new company. I do think they have the chance to be more consistent than the others. The question is, like I said, are they going to be accurate based on what people accept? Finally, I'm not an idealist. I know there's inconsistency, but people are being too harsh. So let's just say you have a PSA 7 and you think, gosh, I think that's undergraded. And you send it in to 3 other grading companies. And I'm not going to say which ones they are, but let's just say you send it into 3. It's a PSA 7. You bust it out. So they can't even see it. The marketplace pricing philosophies of people suggests that these 3 other grading companies would give that PSA 7. One of them might give it a 7. One of them might give it a 7.5, and one of them might give it an 8. Okay. Now, why do I think that's not a huge problem? Because the market has adjusted for that. There are certain companies where a grade of 8 for that company sells the same as a PSA 7. Okay. Now, if you thought it really was an 8, you could send it to PSA and see if you get an 8. But I think that's what the market thinks. That's what they're suggesting. That's the current pricing. If you look at Card Ladder, where they have the different ladder of grades, you'll see, and you think, how could this be? Because a 7 equals a 7. No, the marketplace has said that not only are not a 7 from different companies the same price, but even the 7s that are stronger eye appeal from any one company will be more than the others. So just riffing on consistency and grading. Thanks.
The man in the house of cards.